and welcome back to the Immigration Ain't Easy podcast. I'm Mo Goldman, and today I am honored to have as my guest Parastoo Zahedi, who is an immigration attorney based out of the DC area. Are you DC or Virginia or both?
Virginia, but
Virginia.
20
Yeah.
minutes from DC.
And she has a very diverse background in immigration law, not only being an immigrant herself, which we're going to talk a little bit about. She also has done work in immigration that has touched upon almost every area of immigration law, doing work for humanitarian based immigration cases, family based immigration, Violence Against Women Act, employment based immigration, you name it, federal court litigation. She is just somebody that I look up to as as a mentor, as somebody who's always there to answer questions for her colleagues. I see her always very active on our listservs, there to reach out and help. And she also has been a leader in the American Immigration Lawyers Association, known as AILA. Back in 2007, 2008, she was the president for the Washington, D.C. chapter of our organization. And she speaks at almost every annual conference that we have. So I'm honored to have you as a colleague and somebody who I've always looked up to as a mentor as well. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Mo. And I think we first met when we were both chapter chairs in
Yep,
2007.
we were. Yep.
Yeah.
I
And
think was that the year we had a meeting. It was, I think, in Hawaii, and we were
yes,
in the board meeting, and then all of a sudden there were whales breaching out in the water, and the board meeting
yes,
ended abruptly. We all ran outside to watch the
to watch
whales.
the whales. Yes.
I remember that exactly. It was an interesting time because I think in 2007, 2008 was the time where we were just really starting to see a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment ramping up, especially in Arizona and in some of the other states around the country. I think, do you recall that as well?
Yeah, I do. And I also am serving the community mostly that I serve, the Iranian and a lot of Middle Eastern clients that I have. I would take it even further back a few years where during the Bush administration, there was the NSEERS program where all males from Middle East countries, mostly Muslim countries, had to come in and register. So I guess it started after September 11 for that area geographic, and then it continued and has continued. So yes,
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that, the NSEERS program, and the impact that it's had, or that it had, not only on the community, the Middle Eastern community and the Muslim community, but also like even your own personal, just seeing it happening. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But tell me, what's your backstory? Like, when did you, where were you born? Where did you grow up? I'm just
sure.
curious.
I was born in Tehran, Iran. We came to the United States when I was a young child with my father, who was working as an economist researcher at the Central Bank of Iran, which is affiliated with the World Bank. So before we came to the U.S., we actually spent some 3 months in Italy and in Switzerland. So we were there for a year before that. And then he got transferred to come in on a G visa and be employed with the World Bank for an 18-month period. After his mission ended, he returned back to Iran, but my mother changed her status to a student visa. So I became a dependent from a J. I went to a G. And then from there, my father returned. He had another, and we went. I think we maintained our student visa, though. I lived through the immigration maze, and in front. In fact, I think I've had maybe every type of visa except for an H. I never had an H or an L, but. Then my mother became a diplomat for the during the Shah of Iran's time, and so we had an A visa. My father unfortunately passed away in 1976. He was on his way back and he got into a tragic car accident. And we had remained in the US, my mother in a diplomatic visa, and then she was sponsored. So she was sponsored for employment visa. And so during the diffusing of the Iran and U.S. relations, I actually don't never forget this. I was in school, getting ready to go to school. I think maybe it was 10th grade, and there was a knock at the door, and INS officers back then, they were not called ICE yet. They were at the door at 6 a.m. and there was a knock on the door because my mother was a diplomat. She was asked, all diplomats were asked to leave. But because she had a case pending, she remained. And I opened the door, and as a very young person, I didn't know who these people were. I invited them in. They came in. My mother came out, and my brother and sister were sleeping, and they came out and they introduced themselves, and they wanted to know why she's there, and they wanted to take her to DC with her to their office. As the immigrant child that I am, or the immigrant family that I am, my mother said, no, we have to have tea. I served the ICE officers tea, and they sat there and they drank the tea, and then respectfully took my mother downtown in the INS office, where she was questioned. Her immigration attorney showed up, and then she was released, and we were allowed to continue to be processed. So years later, when I went in for my adjustment of status interview. I never forget this. We sat there for hours and hours, and the INS officer, again at the time, came out and said, "Your files are lost." And we had to recreate the entire file, and they go back later for an interview. Then I became a citizen, and I never thought I would touch immigration again, because, again, as the immigrant child, you can only be a doctor, and I was a pre-med, and so I started as a pre-med. I went to GW, and I took the 4 years as a pre-med. I took the MCATs, and just by serendipity, I guess, I befriended as someone during summer session from GW that I was spending in France, University of Marseille, and I became friends with someone who had just graduated from law school. And the more she talked about it, the more intriguing it became. So I did a 360 or 180, and I went to law school. And then initially, I wasn't doing immigration law. I was doing civil litigation in a very small, medium-sized firm. But they had a lot of immigrants, and I had lived through all of the processes. So it just, it came to me rather than me going to immigration law. And from there, I've been predominantly doing immigration law.
And you started up your own practice in 1993?
Yes. Yeah, I always have to think about when my daughter was born to figure
Yeah.
out. Yeah, and after she was born, then I set up my own practice. Yes.
And were you exclusively doing immigration law at that time?
So initially, when I was with the earlier law firm that I did, they did do a lot of bankruptcies. So initially, I was doing bankruptcies, just Chapter 7s, which is just again regulatory agency filing. But then little by little, as you know, in immigration law, you cannot do everything. You cannot be a jack of all trades. You have to stay in the field in order to be able to be constantly updated and constantly be aware of what is happening. Even, as you know, every Friday or every week or every other day, we get new memos, new policies, new changes in law. So in this area of law, you have to really be a master or an expert. And even within immigration law, and I think you touched upon that I do, because when I started 30 years ago, in fact, one of my mentors was Malcolm Maggio, and he, during a conference and one of my first conferences I attended in DC, he did talk about how you should learn a little bit of every part of immigration law. And I think that's what I do like about it, because if you are sick and tired of maybe the business area, you can go into the asylum cases and deal with that. If you get stressed out or and don't want to deal with removal practice, there's the family, there's the naturalization, and then there is, yes, my federal litigation is mostly for mandamuses and APA actions. So having that to sort through, I think is gives me a good plenty of amount of work to do.
And you mentioned Michael Maggio, who's a legend in the immigration law field. He passed away, it's about 15, 20 years
I
ago.
think 2007, I think, yeah.
Yeah. And you are of counsel now to Maggio, Qatar, Nahajzer, and Alexander, right?
Yes, we started a off-council relationship during COVID, May 2020, where I just served the interests of in an off-council relationship in the removal practice.
So let me ask you, and I think a lot of people don't really understand what immigration law was like before the Immigration Act of 1996 and what it was like after the change in law when it went into effect in 1997. Was it easier or a little bit harder after? Like, how did that impact you, being that you really started to do this right before the law changed? Because that law had such a drastic impact on so many people in different ways and made it so much more difficult.
Sure, yeah, the 1996 IRA Act during the Clinton administration that still affects people to this day. It established the 3-year bar, the 10-year bar, and then the permanent inadmissibility bars. That unfortunately, almost on a daily basis, I have people coming in, and I have to do a dig really into their history. And the minute they are subject, especially the most horrendous bar, I think it's the permanent bar. The minute we find that they are subject to the permanent bar because of their continuous unlawful presence, departure, and reentry, either through a removal order or without a removal order, and not having stayed outside for 10 years and then requesting a waiver, that has very draconian effects to date. So that has been a sore issue, I think, among
Yeah. And it
practitioners.
traps, I think a lot of people who don't really understand or know about what that law did, it traps people. I mean, it puts them in a position where they can't do it the right way. They can't fix their
Sure.
status. They're in this indefinite limbo.
Exactly. And it's not just, it's the attempted entry even that could subject you to the bar. So you can have made an attempted entry to the US, return back, and then you try to enter, and then were successful. That itself subjects you to the permanent bar, and then that brings out the issue that a lot of, I think, non-practitioners don't understand. Why he has a U.S. citizen spouse, he's got U.S. family. Why isn't he a citizen yet? And I get that constantly. He hasn't done anything, and it's not that that person hasn't done anything. The applicant hasn't. There is nothing that he can do. At least for the 3-year, 10-year bar, we have the I-601A waivers and the 601 waivers, where you can show extreme hardship to the U.S. qualifying relative. But in the relation of the permanent bar, we can't. But I guess one good, for a limited period of time, law that did get passed just prior to President Clinton's departure was 245I, that grandfathered a lot of people. I still have 245I cases that's many years later where the individual may have been grandfathered under a parent's petition, and we were able to successfully use that. But 245I itself, after much litigation, doesn't trump
The
the permanent
permanent
bar.
bar. Yeah.
So yeah.
So just for anyone who's listening doesn't understand all this lingo, I'll just give you a short crash course. So the 96 law created these bars, and the permanent bar basically trumps everything. And I hate using the word Trump, but it's, for good reason. It trumps everything. And so you can't overcome that permanent bar without leaving the United States and being outside of the US for at least 10 years. And then you have to get permission to come back into the United States. And it's probably, in most cases, close to impossible to overcome that and to get people to actually, serve that. I guess you would call it a sentence in some ways. But before Clinton left office, there was a law called 245I where if you filed, and it had been in existence previously, but basically it gives people an ability who were here without lawful status, who entered without lawful authorization, and they just don't have a path to a green card, to potentially, in some point in the future, as Parastoo had said, you get grandfathered if you had filed a petition, either family-based or employment-based, on or before April 30th, 2001, with the U.S. government, either at the time INS or the Department of Labor. And what has happened with a lot of those cases is many people have been able to immigrate in spite of that permanent bar, but they have to pay, and I think it was a good justification for it, a penalty. So they pay $1,000 penalty in addition to their other filing fees, and it can get expensive for the average working class person. The one thing I would note about it, and this is something I'm interested to talk to you about in light of the recent alien registration requirement that the White House has implemented. The dilemma we have right now is, and it's really incredible that there are a lot of people who filed on or before April 30th, 2001, who are still not able to get their permanent residency or file for their what's called adjustment of status, because their priority date, the date they filed, is not even current so that they can file it. And most notably, if you want to do a deep dive into what's called the visa bulletin chart, that chart will show you where you can see the processing time is currently set. So, for example, right now, if you had a sibling who petitioned for you on what's called an I-130 petition, a U.S. citizen sibling petitioning for a foreign national, and it was filed April 30th, 2001, that is the date that has been stuck in this visa bulletin for months. And I honestly think it's going to be stuck there for a long, long time, because so many people filed literally on that
day, right?
And they are not eligible to file the next step with their $1,000 penalty and do the adjustment of status until that date in the chart shows May 1st. And so we're stuck. It's a dilemma. Mm-hmm. And this raises an interesting predicament, because many of them were grandfathered where maybe in the future they could get their green card and they've been here just kind of under the radar, living their lives. Now, all of a sudden, this administration is requiring them to register. And if they don't register, they could face some pretty harsh penalties. If they do register, they could be walking into their deportation. If they don't register, not only could they face, monetary or even potentially, I think, imprisonment, penalty-wise, they may get denied on their adjustment of status when they do have a priority date that's current. So it's Sophie's choice, right?
Yes, exactly. And also, there's a group who's exempt from registration, and then just a little note I wanted to make. Everyone needs to really examine the history, especially the way they entered the United States, because part of the group that is exempt from registering is if you actually entered with a non-immigrant visa, but then your visa is expired. Those people also need 245I, and so maybe there's a little bright light, but I think it also makes us as practitioners a little bit hesitant as to whether or not we should advise which way or counsel the individuals whether they should or do not register under the new registration requirements that's kicked in April 11 because of the Fifth Amendment due process.
And I think the from a strictly legal kind of ethical perspective, we're in a position where we have to tell them what the risks are, and they
Yes,
have to decide. And that's
exactly.
usually the case with the
Yes,
work we
exactly.
do, but especially now when there's so much at stake.
I do remember doing the NSEERS
Yeah.
registration. If we can just circle
I was
back
about to go back to that.
to
So,
the history.
why don't you talk about what NSEERS is and how it came about?
Yeah, I like to forget it, but
I
yes.
know.
It started during the Bush administration where they decided, I guess it was a way, a Muslim ban because it affected most Muslim nationals who had been in the United States. What I do remember, if you had entered EWI, entered without inspection, you were exempt from entering and registering. But if you had entered and your visa had expired, you had to go in during given times and register. And I remember I walked in groups of my clients to the registration, and all were very fearful of being arrested on the spot, and many were. But a lot of those people were also people who had already started 245I petitions. I had people who had entered as crew members, C and D, who otherwise are not able to adjust unless they have 245I. And I had one client for whom we had filed in 2001, and it was still at the Department of Labor. He was taken in. Initially when I took him, he was fine, and we walked out. But then a few days later, they came to his residence and took him into detention. And because he had come in on a C visa, I had to argue to the chief ICE officer and write a memo as to how he's grandfather for 245 and can adjust. And I'm bringing that story up because just a few months ago, we went to a restaurant to eat, and he was the manager there in DC, and he came up to me and thanked me, and he says, because of you I'm here, because in detention I wasn't sure if I'll get to sit, get to ever come out. And then he shared pictures of his children and his wife, and and eventually become a citizen. But yes, that itself had draconian effects for individuals who fail to register. After some years, when individuals who were able to adjust status either through family petitions or employment petitions. I remember attending adjustment interviews here where the issue of NSEERS came up. And it was, for NSEERS anyway, it was whether or not you willfully failed to register. And as long as you could show you did not register, it wasn't willful,
You
they
could
would,
get past that.
you
Yeah.
could, yes, you could,
Or
it was
you
a
just late
discretionary.
register. Yeah. I had a couple of
Yes,
late.
or late
Yeah.
registered. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and then in 2011, of course, it was canceled altogether. So
Yeah.
the
But
registration
was
requirements did affect a lot of males, especially
mhm.
males from different Muslim countries.
And that was really I guess if you were going to say a training ground for us as practitioners who were practicing at that time for what to do today
Hmm.
with the
Exactly.
new alien registration requirement, because we went through that. And I will always remember going out to Midwood in New York, out in Brooklyn, and I would be there with Cyrus Mehta and a
Hmm.
few other lawyers, and we would do workshops with these predominantly Pakistani and some Bangladesh men. They were all men.
Hmm.
And I mean, talk about, discriminatory and targeted.
It's
It
true.
was, it was all against men who came in on mainly tourist visas or some sort of non-immigrant visa, of certain age range, pretty wide age range. I think it was like 14 to 60 something, or
Yeah,
it
maybe 16. I can't remember. Yeah,
no, it
yeah,
was a wide range, and it was all Muslim, predominantly Muslim
that's right.
countries. Yeah, and uh, I just, for that, when that started to happen, it was an eye opener for me about how our government can weaponize immigration against people, especially large swaths of people.
Hmm.
So when you decided to go into immigration law, was that something that was very motivated through your own background, your own story, your own family?
Yes, very much so, because I had lived through all of the phases. Again, as an immigrant, even during the hostage crisis, being from Iran, I lived an immigrant life in that there was even during the hostage crisis from Iran for that many years, there was a backlash against Iranians, and so as a
Mm,
student, I was subjected to it. But those who knew me and knew my family, knew my background, but then to others, the minute you would have to hide your identity, you would have to hide that you are Iranian and you're from Iran originally. So that is at different given times has affected different immigrant communities.
sure. Have you done, I know you do litigation, but have you done writs of mandamus,
Oh yes,
those
yeah.
types of
I
cases?
Again, the majority of
Yeah,
my clients being Iranian
with
or
those.
from other nationalities as well. And that's one thing I do like of immigration law. It exposes me to nations and countries and issues that I would never know about. I did an asylum case for a person from Uzbekistan. I had to learn about all of but similar patterns of authoritarian regimes in different countries, and you basically you look at how the journalists and then the writers and the political opponents and the students were oppressed, and it's as if each authoritarian regime is following the same book.
The
Yeah,
template. Yep.
exactly right. So as far as the mandamuses, I've been for the past few years, I've been heavily dealing with mandamuses for asylum applications, asylum applicants who filed 10 years ago, who still haven't had their interviews. Some of them my own clients, but many I've started taking on, not just from Iran or Muslim countries, but I've had Ethiopian clients. I had a Chinese lady, and who, after 5 years of it not going anywhere, we've been filing mandamuses. We get the interviews. We hold the government to its timeline of adjudicating them within 120 days before we dismiss them. But mandamus is related to long pending applications. I had one case and most of the time they've been agreeing with the case. I did have one case that I had to litigate, a motion to dismiss that the government filed when my client, who had filed an adjustment of status that had been pending for 14 years. He had obtained asylum from court, but his case had been pending for 14 years, and we filed the mandamus. And the government's position was that the fact that the case is pending is a good thing. And I had to go in and argue a motion for summary judgment motion that the government had made. And I argued to the federal judge here at Eastern District of Virginia, if there was some action being taken on their case, then maybe we can say it's a good thing. But no action had been taken. Nothing had been done by USCIS for 14 years. And I had to show how it has affected and harmed my client because the judge actually asked me. And I said, oh, let's see. Every year he has to renew his work permit. Back then it was yearly. It wasn't, now it's been 5 years. Every year he has to fill out new employment documentation. He cannot travel. He cannot freely travel to any place. He cannot have I went down the laundry list and the judge said, okay, I've heard enough. And he actually denied the motion to dismiss. And magically, within 90 days, we got the green card. So,
Well, it always harkens back to, and one of our colleagues says this all the time, Chuck Cook, sue the bastards.
yes,
He always
yes.
says that. And that's what, I mean, really, it's one of the few weapons we have to fight back against a government that will sit on these cases indefinitely.
Right,
And unless the person sues, they probably will not see an end to this indefinite wait.
right, right.
And so when you've had a lot of these cases, are most of the delays because, well, obviously asylum, where they've had an interview or they've already had some sort of step in that direction, are they because of background checks?
Well, no, I think majority of the asylum cases got just stuck because
Mm.
of the priority changing in the
Oh, that change.
administrations.
Mm.
And so they were sending for a period of time, the priority was, it keeps changing. The priority was just
First
unaccompanied
in, first out, and
first in, first
yeah,
out, then it was last in, first out, and then it became
Afghans
the southern, yes, exactly, or the
and the
southern
southern
border
border. Yeah.
cases. And so priorities changing and the lack of resources, lack of officers basically led to a huge backlog. And so our only choice was to sue and in order to
And
get an interview.
in most of those cases, does the U.S. Attorney's Office back down and
Oh,
say,
they hate these cases, I found.
yeah,
You become friends with them. So here their position is, oh,
we don't want to deal with this?
yeah, exactly.
And so they'll call their client and get usually something done before you have to even litigate it, or
They usually, here in EDVA, they offer you the interview dates and offer you a joint motion to stay pending the interview and adjudication within 120 days. I've had a few times where, because of background checks, it's gone beyond 120 days after the interview. But fairly often, it does end within 120 days after the interview or shorter time.
is there a case or maybe a couple of cases that in your life and your career stand out to you as being something where, you know, obviously we will often do kind of more rudimentary work like processing people's visas or just, you know, doing transactional type of immigration work where we're just getting them benefits, work permits. Is there like any case or maybe a couple of cases that you can speak to in, you know, even a more general context that stand out to you that make, you know, just made you feel like this is why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I feel proud about what I do?
Yeah, and as you said, the business cases have their nuance, and I enjoy
Mhm.
doing them because at the end of the day, you want the United States to prosper, have gifted individuals, have highly educated individuals come to the U.S. workforce and work for the U.S. to develop vaccines. And I had one who was a civil engineer who I got a national interest waiver because she was instrumental as a Greek national in the metro system. And so those things benefit the U.S. We do them, but as you say, they're just the applications and the applicants and building the case. The human factor in the humanitarian is in the humanitarian area, and I would have to go to the asylum cases, several that I've had. I think one of the most challenging cases I had, which was where an Iranian asylum applicant had filed asylum in the 90s, but had, unbeknownst to him, had been scheduled for an interview, had missed that interview, never received notice. His attorney had been actually the first attorney was not even an attorney. His attorney had uh, left the country, and years later he was picked up by INS because his case had gone to removal proceedings. He had missed that. He got an in absentia order, and that was in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. And then he hired an attorney sometime in early 2000s to file a motion to reopen when he discovered that. And that motion was denied to pursue his asylum application. And so go to 2011, I think, is when his family came to me, his brother came to me, and he had just been picked up. And because he had a valid passport, or they had found a passport for him that still was valid, he was on his way to being deported to Iran, and he had a final order. The motion to reopen had been denied. And so this individual, I literally filed a stay and a motion to rescind and with the immigration judge. They had picked him up on his way to be deported, and the immigration judge had just signed a stay. And that case I'll never forget because I had to call the ICE officer, and he very rudely said he's not here. I had to call the DHS counsel, who was kind enough to call off the deportation. And so he came in. Finally he had his day in court, and he became an asylee. It was a very interesting facts. He had suffered quite a bit in Iran as because of sexual orientation, and so it was a horrific set of facts, horrific conditions. I was very proud of that case because it was a lot of work, but it did a lot of good because you saved one individual, and that's all that matters to keep you going. It's the starfish story where you save one starfish at a time when I'm sure you've heard that story, right? And so that was one case I'm always very proud of. He became a citizen and we went to his interview. He changed his name to a very American name. And when the officer asked him, why are you choosing this name? Part of his name became Brandon. He put a and so he was asked, the officer said, I'm just curious, why are you choosing that? And he said, because I really want an American name. I've been here all my years, and I was a devout follower of Beverly Hills 90210, and Brandon
That's
was
awesome.
American.
The brother, the lead brother by Jason Priestley
Yes,
was
yes.
Brandon.
So yeah,
That is
it was.
hilarious.
It came
Wow.
a good ending.
Goes
Very
to
tough
show
start.
our culture, how it impacts people, especially pop culture.
Yeah, I actually had another Ethiopian who came to me. She was in a traffic accident on her way to court, but the judge had denied her case. They came in late with her attorney. The attorney filed a motion to reopen, denied. This was a judge in Baltimore that had a very high deny rate. He's no longer in an immigration judge, and filed an appeal. It was denied. A second attorney filed. I think it was at least three times. And she came to me 2015 or 16. And right when she came to me, a new BIA decision had come out related to traffic and issues related to missing court because of extraordinary circumstances. And I used that. I reached out, several attorneys I reached out to get the case, joint motion to reopen, prosecutorial discretion.
Yeah.
And somehow, somewhere, my first attempt did not go well. They denied it. Somehow, somewhere, I finally got someone, and I had, this case was huge as far as paperwork. But I never forget when I called her, she just burst out crying because we got her case reopened. She was 245I. And so we adjusted her status based on an ancient mother's petition, U.S. citizen mother. And now she's also a citizen. So
That's so
those were
great.
two. good outcomes. And I guess this is why you're pushed to do.
I was going to say that's what motivates you to go back the next day and keep pushing, right?
Right.
The success cases, and we do deal with a lot of pain and heartache as well,
Yeah.
which brings me to my next question. How do you deal with the emotions that as lawyers we have to contend with, because we are counselors? It is our role to counsel people, and we have a lot of people who depend on us, and it does get to be a bit stressful, I would think. What do you do, or what do you practice to try to maintain a semblance of normalcy and sanity and not get overwhelmed?
You hit it. You do get overwhelmed, especially because you see these horrific stories, and then if the laws are being changing to a way that you cannot help these people, you become even more frustrated. There are days you want to give up, but you can't, or at least you have to put up a brave front and show that your client, I got this, even though you're thinking, what the hell am I doing? How am I going to fix this? But I've always lived with the mantra of this too shall pass, and I have to constantly remind myself of that. You do internalize a lot of the facts, internalize a lot of the issues, but you just have to do the best. And under the circumstances, personally, I do outside activities to refresh me, to bring me energy. I exercise a lot. I actually teach exercise, and I've been teaching exercise for many years. And one of the reasons I do that in order to get out of the mind that I have during the day, and I come out with fresh oxygen and a fresh way of approaching things. And I think that helps. I think having a life outside our office really does help us to get us the energy we need and just the focus to come back with fresh eyes and the next day, the next hour, or however we want to go forward with the case.
You know what? And you and I have met each other and talked over the years, and we have a nice working relationship. But one thing that you exude that I've noticed is you have a lot of love and care. Is that something that was instilled in you through your parents?
Most likely with my mother, yes, of
Mhm.
course. I most likely, no, 100% my mother, yes. She still is the pillar of strength and the woman I call on a daily basis to get support and advice, and she's always has my back. And so if I'm feeling down, I just pick up the phone and talk to her, and she gives me the love and the support and the nurturing that I've received through all my life, even at this age. I'm afraid if I don't call her one day missed, the next day I will hear from her. But yes, yeah, oh yeah, we're very close family. My brother, my sister, and my mother, and now my daughter and my husband, of course. So we depend on each other. We give each other strength and support, and um,
Can
I
you
like to
talk? Oh, good.
take that forward, I
Yeah.
guess.
Can you talk a little bit about and I think in the last 3 months, and by the time I get this published, probably be about 4 months since the new administration came in, and there's been a lot of talk about flooding the zone,
Mhm.
and what that really means for the population in the United States, especially the immigrant population, where all these new policies are being implemented weekly, sometimes daily, that are very stressful for people because it's hard to navigate a system that is already dysfunctional. And now all these new policies are going into effect. How how are you dealing with that? And what? Just, I mean, as a legal community, how do you have any advice for people on how we can work through this, especially these times where it feels like we don't have all the answers for people. In fact, we don't have answers for a lot of people. When U.S. citizens, and I bet you've gotten some of these
Mhm.
messages from people you know who are probably born here, who are
Mhm.
worried about traveling internationally and being questioned or having their phones examined coming back into the United States. Like, how are you dealing with this?
Yeah, I see the fear, as you
Mm-hmm.
say, legal residents, U.S. citizens, it doesn't matter. Legal non-immigrant students, as we've seen, anyone who shouldn't worry is still worried. And you just have to advise them and actually hope that at least the judicial branch will get it right and will continue the battles. And I've seen, and I have to say, as part of American Immigration Law Association, one thing that I've seen a huge increase of is litigation. I think a lot of us have become litigators, and a lot of us are now approaching cases differently. Um, Perhaps during other administrations, we were able to maybe pick up the phone or send an email to a USCIS officer or through the ombudsman or through other means of working the case, get the case congressional or some other way. But right now, on the current way things are going, I think litigation. And I've seen a huge surge of litigators in our practice now because that is the only way that we can go forward with
Fight
a lot
back,
of
yeah.
these cases, right? Fight, well, just litigating the cases,
Well,
right?
and the student visa issues, I
Right.
mean, it's just absolutely astounding where, now we're starting to see this declaration from Andre Watson that talks about,
I saw that, yeah.
yeah, where he comes out, I think it was like in line 21 or 22 of the declaration, he comes out and basically says that these students were not out of legal status. And so then it raises the question of like, why this disinformation? Because some of
Hmm.
these students have left the United States
Hmm.
but thinking they were accruing unlawful presence in the US and they were
Yes.
trying to do the right thing. I had a young man who already left and went back to India, even though I told him, I said, you can stay and you can litigate and fight. It's so discouraging
Yeah, and it's again, you hope the courts will do
to do
right.
the
But then,
right
as
thing.
you just mentioned, we are losing people who either through fear or maybe they are so just not wanting to stay here anymore. They don't want to have to when they're studying here. I've had H-1B employers who do not want to continue remaining in the United States. They've never been in the US illegally. They've never had unauthorized status. They have children born in the United States, but they're Indian nationals. Their petitions are going to take, as you mentioned, the priority date, 10, maybe 20 years until the priority date is current. I am seeing a lot of discussions with individuals who do not wish to remain, and I'm seeing them move to Canada. On a daily basis, I'm asked for advice related to immigration to Canada. Do you have names to Canadian? And it is unfortunate because we educate these students in the United States. They get US degrees, but then they take that degree and skill and education to another country. Maybe it hasn't hurt the United States yet, but it will. It will cause a brain
Yeah.
that
The I call it the reverse brain drain.
exactly.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's a branding problem for this country right now because what is our brand? And I've always thought of like the United States brand, while not perfect and has a very, it's got a past of beautiful things and great things and some horrific things. Like, there's no perfect nation out there, but I always thought of it as one of the better of those imperfect nations and an imperfect union. And what is our brand around the world now? Because we were looked at as one of those places where people could depend upon us, and that's going to be hard. I think it's going to be hard for the university and the higher education community to to recruit. It's going to be harder for businesses to recruit people to come here. They might do more, like you said, offshoring and having them work in other places, and that's just not good for our economy.
No, it will affect, yeah, tremendously. I think the lack of teachers, lack of nurses that are predominantly from IT, um, and it'll take years before we could, and it will also, again, you're going back now, never staying off of immigration, but economy, but it would have an effect as far as advancement of the U.S. in technology, advancement of the U.S. in every area, in medicine, in many different areas, because every area, if you look at it, has an immigrant backbone to it. If you look at all of the main Google or any of these big giant companies, they were initially formed by immigrants. So Uber, they're all, I meant name two that are owned but were founded by Iranians, but yeah, Iranian Americans. But yeah, eBay is another Iranian American. Every one of those was funded by immigrants.
Let's talk a little bit positive, because there's a lot of negative out there. What has this country given to you?
Opportunity, I think. Opportunity to study at the best schools, in the country. Opportunity to build a practice, and again, opportunity to be able to freely travel, freely think, freely work to my abilities and to my likes and dislikes, opportunity to discuss my beliefs and opinions freely without censorship and without fear. So I think those are all the reasons why most people come to the United States. And so, yeah, and having the opportunity to live here and become an American. And I think I'm more, I'm Iranian American, but then I don't see myself as, I always wonder, why do we give each other Iranian American, Italian American? We're all Americans. And so,
Exactly.
yeah,
And it's interesting because it kind of divides us. It
true.
does. It is a kind of dividing way to phrase things. Like, why can't we just say, I'm an American,
Exactly.
because we're all Americans. And some of us don't have even that, like, that certificate or the birth certificate or the certificate of naturalization, but they have that core value and belief of what is an American, and that we are a nation of immigrants, and that we are a welcoming nation.
Right.
You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to mention
No, I
before
thank
I?
you. This was
This is wonderful. I thank you. Parastoo Zahedi. You are somebody that I appreciate, and I'm so glad that we're able to do this. And I look forward to continue working with you in the months and years to come as a colleague. And also thank you to my daughter, Emma, who I
yes,
always
thank you.
thank at the end of my episodes. She's really helpful in all the technical stuff that I don't understand. But yeah, thank you for joining me on Immigration Ain't Easy. And you are a good example of, how it's not easy and how difficult it is. And so it's kind of a perfect place for us to talk about this.
Yeah. Thank you, Mo. Thank you for the opportunity. Speaking of opportunities, thank you for the opportunity to have a conversation with you about, what we immigrant nerds, I guess.
Yeah, we are immigrant nerds.
Yeah.
Well, thanks
Thank
so
you again.
much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.